Hi, everybody. My name is Sharik Hassan, and I'm an associate professor here at the Fuqua School of Business in the Strategy Group. And for the last decade, I've been studying entrepreneurs and the entrepreneurial process and what makes some startups more successful than others. And so today I'm going to be talking about a new paper I have with colleagues of mine here at Fuqua, Ronnie Chatterjee, and at the Harvard Business School, Rem Koning, on the use of the scientific method and randomized controlled trials in startup decision making. So let me open up my slides and share with you some of the insights we've gained from doing this study about startups and startup decision making. So I guess the big question is, how should startups make decisions? What decision-making framework should a startup use? And to be honest, most startups and most small businesses have a pretty standard framework for making decisions, which is trust your gut. Maybe collect a little bit of data, but usually, entrepreneurs have a belief about something that their startup should do, and they pursue it and they follow through. But there's an alternative to kind of decision making for startups that actually has been diffusing in the entrepreneurship world. And it actually builds on how we make decisions in other contexts with very high stakes. So, as all of us know, one of the biggest questions over the last several months has been, how do we, subdue the coronavirus pandemic? And one of the most important tools for us to do that was the vaccine. But we can't just throw a vaccine out there and see if it works or not at scale. We have to test it first. And so the way that happens is that the pharmaceutical company goes and does a randomized controlled trial to figure out whether the vaccine works, reduces infections, versus a control group. And this scientific method is critical because it provides unbiased data about whether a course of action, in this case, a vaccine, works or not. What's been quite interesting is that this approach of running a randomized controlled trial has become something that startups have begun to do as well. And the word that they use to talk about RCTs in the entrepreneurship context is the A/B test. A is one condition, B is another condition, and once a test is run, we get to see which performs better, condition A or condition B. So I'll give you some examples of what tests look like, but let me just give you one example. LinkedIn, for instance, the platform we're using to stream this discussion today, uses A/B testing to test lots and lots of different things. For instance, algorithms that recommend posts to you, or what ads are served, or what jobs are recommended to you as ones that you should potentially apply to. And these tests then inform how the product is designed. And so A/B testing tools allow managers to vary nearly any part of a digital product or service. So newspapers, for instance, regularly test headlines to see what readers what appeals to readers in terms of clicks, what articles they spend more time reading, which ones they don't spend time reading, and figure out really how do you get the engagement that you want. And they do this by testing lots of different headlines for any given article. And one of the biggest changes over the last decade has been the diffusion of technology that actually makes running not just one experiment, but potentially hundreds, if not thousands of experiments at any given time possible for startups. So the question we were really interested in as researchers is, does this approach to entrepreneurial strategy and entrepreneurial decision making actually lead to better performance? And we wanted to do the study with a large number of startups to see, does it work? How impactful is this approach to decision making, and who does it work for? So, one thing that we were kind of pushing up against was this idea that had actually, become conventional wisdom in a lot of circles, especially in academic circles, but also amongst people in the tech industry, that A/B tests were really about incremental choices. Like, for instance, what color button should you have to increase the number of click-throughs on a website? The famous example is Google testing, dozens of shades of blue to figure out what the right one was for their search engine. And here's a page from Hacker News saying, A/B testing may not be as effective potentially as we think it might be, because all people are testing are these incremental ideas. On the other hand, a lot of companies have started using A/B tests to really figure out what their entrepreneurial strategy should be, how they should design their product, what customer segments they should be going after. And there's been a lot of discussion amongst practitioners to figure out, what does A/B testing allow a startup to do that can improve performance? One is it helps mute the impact of bad ideas. Instead of launching an idea or a product change at scale without knowing whether it works or not, you test it like you test a vaccine to see whether it works in a smaller population. And if it does work, then you can launch it more broadly. So one is just making sure that you don't make mistakes in launching things that don't work. The other thing that A/B testing is thought to do for startups is really kind of democratize decision making. One of the challenges for startups, particularly growing startups, is whose ideas are the ones that are implemented. And oftentimes, the ideas that are implemented are the ones that are proposed by top leadership, or the product manager who's the most vocal. And this essentially hinders the ability to really take really positive, good, high quality ideas from all different parts of the organization that may be really beneficial, but the person might not have a voice or may not be convincing because they don't have the data to really democratize and give those ideas some voice. And startups have said that by running A/B tests and actually having a quantitative metric, around which of their ideas work and don't work, they're seeing ideas from many different parts of the organization. If you have hundreds of 100 engineers, they'll probably have dozens of ideas, which means hundreds of ideas to potentially test and see which one actually works. So it opens up ideation inside the startup. It also speeds up decision making because there's a lot less discussion about whether something works or not, because now you have the data, and the data can basically shorten the time that it takes to discuss the pros and cons of an idea, because you know whether it works or not, and then you can move forward. So it speeds up decision making as well. And then, finally, I think it adds a degree of quantification, both in terms of understanding, what the benefits are, but also what the costs are. So if you want to make a big change and there may be some downside initially, you can quantify what that downside might be, because you can then, compensate for it by having, other parts of your product generate the clicks that you need, or the traffic that you need to actually meet your revenue numbers. And I think one more thing that may be worth mentioning is that A/B testing, because it's quantified, allows you to take a big change, like a huge strategic bet about launching a brand new product, and break it up into little pieces that can then be individually tested, so you can de-risk a lot of the challenges that come with making big changes to your product. But how do we actually test whether A/B testing works or not? So the interesting thing is that to actually test whether A/B testing works, we run an experiment because you can get startups to randomly decide whether to run A/B tests or not. So we had to kind of come up with another approach. And our team realized that we could actually figure out by looking at the JavaScript on websites to see basically whether a company is using A/B testing software or not. Here's like an example from a company called charitywater.org, and you can see that they're using A/B testing software called Optimizely. So we got data on 35,000, actually more than 35,000 global startups that were founded between 2008 and 2013 from a variety of different sources. We were able to basically measure when that startup adopted A/B testing. And we also got data which had pretty amazing metrics on how many website hits that site had every given week from the time period we studied, the bounce rates, as well as other user metrics. We also got data on product launches as well as code changes to the websites over this time. So a couple of really interesting statistics. One thing we were really surprised by was that not a lot of startups use A/B testing, at least a lot less than we thought did. About 18% of the startups in our sample used A/B testing over the period that we studied. That wasn't actually as large as we thought. But maybe I can kind of get to kind of the heart of the matter, which is, does it work? And what we found is A/B testing actually has a pretty significant impact on the performance of these startups, and this impact is increasing over time. As you can see in this graph, the 0 point right here in the middle basically says this is the point where the startup adopted A/B testing. And here is the effect on page views, which is one of our most important metrics, and it's an important metric for a lot of startups. As you can see, before A/B testing, there's no effect. Once the startup adopts A/B testing, basically by the 52nd week, you have a pretty large and growing effect of A/B testing on the startup's performance. We also find some really interesting things. We find that startups that use A/B testing make more changes to the code of their website, both in terms of the overall HTML structure, the visual style of the website, and they're much more likely to make these very significant major code changes. And we also found that they're more likely and much more likely to more often make changes to their products. And we tested this in a lot of different ways. And we can see, especially in these two graphs right here, but kind of similar to the effect that we see here, is that this effect is increasing over time. So what's kind of the big takeaway here is that the scientific method applied to business decision-making can be a very powerful tool. A/B testing is just one instantiation of actual data-driven decision-making by firms that can have a powerful effect on the quality of a decision that a startup makes. And by reducing the cost of actually testing hypotheses about what product changes they should make, firms can actually make better decisions and increase their performance quite rapidly. We were able to show the impact of A/B testing on a variety of metrics, including page views, usage stats, code changes, new product introductions. And this effect seems to be increasing over time. And actually, the startups that seem to benefit the most are the ones that are smaller and less established, and often outside of the major entrepreneurial hubs like Silicon Valley. And so this kind of supports this idea that decision making may be an important bottleneck for startup success, and that using a more scientific, rigorous approach to startup decision making can really improve the quality of a startup's performance. Great. I'm getting some questions now. So one question is, what A/B testing software do you like best, and are there specific pros and cons of different platforms or for specific applications? So there's actually a lot of platforms that you can use to do A/B testing. Actually, many of them, I don't want to pitch any one given platform, but there's a lot. Optimizely, as well as Google, have their own platforms. Many of them actually have the same exact features. There's really the core features are very similar because what you're doing is running a randomized control trial. I think where the real bottleneck comes from is where are the ideas coming from and what is the organizational structure around experimentation. And so the key thing is, can you develop a culture around a given piece of technology like A/B testing software that actually encourages people to come up with lots of ideas and test them? And I think that actually is a bigger bottleneck for a lot of companies rather than the software. Many companies, especially when they're large and have much more complicated products, they actually develop their own internal A/B testing platform. I know Microsoft has its own internal A/B testing platform, and a lot of other companies that do a lot of A/B tests do that as well. I think what we learned in our interviews with product managers is that initially any software will do a pretty good job in terms of getting you to run A/B tests. And a lot of great features have been built into platforms like Optimizely and the Google platform to make sure that you're not like stopping tests early and so on. But the key thing is kind of getting used to running tests. Great. I have a couple of other questions. So what are other types of experiments that you research or recommend? So A/B tests are like RCTs. They're randomized control trials. You randomly assign one group of people to get one product condition and another group of people to get another product condition. I think that's the gold standard. While we didn't study other types of experimentation, I think startups, actually companies, have been doing kind of informal experiments historically, and researchers found that they matter as well. And I think, maybe the baseline is that once data informs your decision making, you're probably making better decisions than if data isn't informing your decision making. So I think data is kind of a critical input. And so measurement is a key thing, even if you're not actually doing formal experiments. I got another question by David. How did the long-term performance of startups using A/B testing compare to established companies using A/B testing? So what we find, interestingly, is that more established startups get a little bit less of a boost from A/B testing than younger startups, like brand new startups. I think part of it is there's a lot more to learn about your product and your product market fit for young startups than an older, more established company that has a clear consumer in mind. So the effects are actually larger for these younger, less established startups, but that's because their absolute kind of base where they're starting from is lower. So there's like lots of gain that can be made for them. Whereas for more established startups, really it's kind of like tweaking and honing and refining an existing product, and that can be extremely valuable, right? I mean, if you have a 500 million or 1 billion users, and you do a 1% change that increases revenue, that could be really powerful. So although the relative magnitude of the effect is maybe smaller for more established startups, the impact in terms of revenue may be actually quite large. But we definitely see that in terms of like the total gains that can be made, younger startups actually tend to kind of benefit a little bit more. Another question that we're getting is when should we start A/B testing? When should a startup do this? Part of it is that you should be thinking about data very early on and really formulating clear hypotheses at the earliest stages of your startup process. The challenge with running A/B tests very early on is that you may not actually have the volume of users to run kind of very precise tests, but that doesn't necessarily mean that data and experimentation aren't valuable early on. They just may tell you something a little bit different. Okay, another question is how does A/B testing get implemented inside companies that aren't data driven? One way to think about it is that I think there needs to be a kind of a culture of experimentation inside of a company. And in the end, if people at the top are not using the evidence from A/B tests to make their decisions, it's really going to be hard to build that culture. And so it's really important to get buy-in at the very top of the organization to make sure that the results of these A/B tests are incorporated into the decision-making of the company. And once that's the case, from our discussions with product managers, we see that it becomes a part of their culture. Product managers and people below the product managers realize that for them to make a pitch to senior management, they have to bring numbers with them, and they have to bring the results of an experiment with them when they're trying to convince senior management to make a change. Okay. So a more technical question is, what approach should we follow to get an estimate of the sample size for an A/B test? So this is used to be actually much harder, but it's much easier now. One is actually to figure out what is the effect that you're expecting? How big of a effect size are you expecting? That's probably the first thing you want to kind of figure out, right? Because that is going to be then key to decide, well, how big of a sample do I need? Once you actually have a clear hypothesis of what you're expecting from a change and a good theory of change, that effect size can be kind of deduced, or kind of, you can make an educated guess about it. Once you know that effect size, the software, A/B testing software, can allow you to very easily calculate that sample size for an A/B test. The smaller the effect, the larger the sample size. The bigger the effect, the smaller the sample size. That's kind of the general pattern. So maybe another kind of question is, what if everyone adopts A/B testing? Can it still lead to a competitive advantage for startups? And that's actually a really good and important question. If everyone can A/B test, is it something that really differentiates one startup from the other? And the answer is yes and no. So I'll answer the no part. Well, I mean, if you're doing mediocre tests with kind of just out of the box software, it might not be enough to differentiate yourself from the competition. But as an organization, if you're able to develop good routines around generating ideas, making sure that the results of the A/B tests are informing decisions, designing high quality tests that are driven by clearly specified hypotheses, you will probably do better than your competition in terms of leveraging the A/B testing technology to increase your performance. So I think these were all fantastic questions. Thank you so much for giving me an opportunity to share some of my findings with my colleagues about A/B testing. And I think the evidence from our study is that being more rigorous in terms of figuring out how to value the options, the different paths your startup can take in a more rigorous way using the scientific method, using randomized controlled trials, can have a pretty significant and almost immediate payoff on performance. Thanks very much for giving me this opportunity, and I look forward to engaging with you again in the future.